Something's on the timber!
Yeah, looks alive.
Carl Powell had served with the United States Coast Guard for 12 years, a career spent entirely at the Coos Bay facility on the rugged southern Oregon coast. In all those years, through countless squalls and winter gales, he had never seen a storm like the one that rolled in on that November afternoon. The sky, a canvas of atmospheric violence, turned the color of old bruises, a mottled, churning mix of purple, black, and bruised gray. The wind, born 1,000 miles out in the Pacific, came howling ashore with a fury that rattled the very foundations of the station, sending loose equipment tumbling across the concrete yard like children's toys. The Weather Service had been tracking the system for 3 days, their bulletins growing more urgent with each update as it built strength, churning its way toward the coastline. By the time it made landfall, the waves were already cresting at a monstrous 20 feet, with forecasts predicting they would climb higher still into the realm of legend. Carl stood in the operations room, a space humming with the low thrum of electronics and high-strung tension. He stood alongside his crew, watching the radar screens pulse with menacing bands of green, yellow, and an angry, spreading red that signified the storm's core. The air was thick with the crackle of static-filled emergency channels, punctuated by the desperate, fragmented distress calls from fishing vessels caught too far from the sanctuary of the harbor when the storm hit with unexpected speed. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Brennan was coordinating the response, her voice a beacon of calm and measured authority in the growing chaos. She moved between consoles, her focus absolute, directing the available crews to the most critical situations first, a triage of lives against the overwhelming power of the sea. Carl's team was assigned to the motor lifeboat 47-225, a 47-foot vessel designed specifically for operations in heavy weather, a self-righting beast of steel and engineering. He had made this run dozens of times before, pulling stranded fishermen from disabled boats, towing crippled vessels back to port, searching for survivors in conditions that would reduce most people to terrified prayers. The crew assembled with practiced efficiency in the equipment room. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and neoprene. They pulled on their bright orange dry suits over their uniforms, the bulky material a second skin against the lethal cold of the Pacific. They meticulously checked the seals at their wrists, ankles, and neck, ensuring everything was watertight. In water this cold, hypothermia was a swift and merciless killer, capable of ending a life in minutes. Carl's teammates were men he had worked with for years, men he trusted with his life every time they went out into the churning maw. There was Derek Simmons, the boat's engineer, a stocky, unflappable man from Idaho, who seemed to possess an almost mystical ability to fix any mechanical problem, with nothing but duct tape, a wrench, and sheer determination. Martin Fisher served as the navigator, a quiet, thoughtful guy from Wisconsin who had an uncanny, almost supernatural ability to read the ocean's moods and find safe passages through seemingly impossible conditions. The newest member of the team was young Tommy Vasquez, just 23 years old, his face still holding a trace of youthful eagerness. He was capable and strong, but still learning the hard, unforgiving lessons that only experience in the heart of a storm could teach. They launched the motor lifeboat into conditions that pushed the absolute limits of what even the most seasoned Coast Guard crews considered acceptable. The vessel slammed down hard into the troughs between waves, the impact shuddering through the deck plates before climbing the near-vertical faces of swells that towered above them like moving walls of dark, liquid granite. The rain was not falling, but being driven horizontally, a torrent of stinging needles propelled by winds that screamed across the surface, reducing visibility to almost nothing despite the powerful searchlights mounted on the boat's superstructure. Carl stood at the helm, his hands gripping the wheel with a pressure that ached in his bones. feeling every shudder and gut-wrenching impact as the boat fought its way through the storm. He followed the coordinates that dispatch had provided for the Sea Serpent, a fishing vessel that had lost all power and was drifting inexorably toward the jagged rocks of the headland. They found the fishing boat 3 miles offshore, a ghost ship wallowing helplessly in the heavy seas, its lights flickering and dying. They spent a grueling 90 minutes in conditions that would haunt Carl's dreams for weeks afterward, the two vessels pitching and rolling in a violent, uncoordinated dance. Finally, after multiple failed attempts that saw lines snap and men nearly swept overboard, they secured a tow line and began the slow, perilous journey back toward the protected waters of the bay. The sun was setting somewhere beyond the impenetrable wall of storm clouds, turning the world into a bleak monochrome of grey and darker grey when the radio crackled with a new transmission. The message made everyone in the wheelhouse go utterly quiet and still, the only sound the roar of the wind and the groaning of the boat's engines. It was the pilot of a Coast Guard Jayhawk helicopter that had been conducting a search pattern further north, his voice tight with an emotion Carl couldn't quite place. Confusion, perhaps, or sheer disbelief. He reported spotting what appeared to be a person clinging to a large piece of debris, approximately 8 miles offshore, riding the massive waves in an area where no vessels had been reported missing, no other distress calls had been received. The helicopter could not attempt a rescue in these conditions. The winds were too violent, making it far too dangerous to lower a rescue basket. They needed a boat crew to investigate and retrieve whoever was out there, alone in the heart of the storm. Lieutenant Commander Brennan's voice came through the radio a moment later, crisp and decisive, with new orders. She directed Carl's crew to hand off the fishing vessel tow to another boat being dispatched from the station and proceed immediately to the coordinates the helicopter had provided. Carl acknowledged the transmission without hesitation, his mind already calculating the new risks. He altered course, pushing the motor lifeboat northwest, away from the relative safety of the coastline and out into the open ocean, where the storm's full, unobstructed power could hammer down upon them. The waves had grown to a terrifying 25 feet by the time they reached the search area, massive rolling mountains of water that lifted the boat high on their crests, offering a fleeting, panoramic view of the chaos before dropping it into deep valleys where the wind seemed to momentarily disappear, an eerie silence before it roared back with renewed violence. Martin stood beside Carl at the navigation station, his eyes fixed on the screens, calling out course corrections, watching the GPS coordinates tick closer to the location the helicopter had reported. Derek and Tommy were on the aft deck, secured by safety lines, their bodies braced against the rolling of the boat, methodically sweeping the darkness with searchlights that barely penetrated the curtain of rain and spray. It was Tommy who spotted it first. His young voice, cracking slightly with a mix of excitement and strain, shouted above the wind, his arm pointing off the port bow toward a dark shape, rising and falling with the swells. Carl brought the boat around carefully, fighting the helm to maintain control as the motor lifeboat rolled and pitched violently. He brought the main searchlights to bear on whatever was out there in the storm-tossed water. What they saw made no sense at first, the human brain struggling, failing to process the impossible image illuminated in the harsh, sterile white beams. There was debris, certainly. A massive section of what looked like an old dock or pier, weathered planks held together by thick, creosote-blackened beams, riding the waves like a crude, makeshift raft. But clinging to that debris was something that could not possibly be there. Something that should not exist outside of campfire stories and blurry, debated photographs on internet conspiracy sites. It was huge, far larger than any human, with arms as thick as tree trunks wrapped around one of the central beams. Its body was covered entirely in long, dark hair that hung in wet, matted clumps, streaming water as the debris rose on the crest of each swell. Carl's first thought The rational, trained part of his mind, trying desperately to impose order on the impossible, was that it must be a bear. A large black bear, somehow swept out to sea during the storm, clinging to the wreckage in a desperate primal attempt to survive. But as the searchlight held steady on the figure, as the boat drew closer and the details became chillingly clearer, that explanation crumbled away like sand in the surf. The proportions were all wrong for a bear. The limbs were too long and articulated, the torso too broad and upright. And when the creature turned its head toward the blinding light, when Carl saw the face caught in that brilliant, unforgiving beam, his blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the November storm. The face was not human, but it was not purely animal either. It was something caught, impossibly, terrifyingly between the two, with a heavy, protruding brow ridge shadowing eyes that reflected the searchlight with a disturbing amber glow. The nose was broad and flat, the jaw massive and powerful, and the expression on that face as it stared at the approaching boat was one of pure, primitive terror. The creature opened its mouth and made a sound that cut through even the howling wind, a guttural scream that was neither human nor animal, a vocalization that carried notes of fear, rage, and something else, a deep, resonant sorrow that Carl could not identify, but that made his stomach clench with an instinctive, inexplicable dread. Derek's voice came from the deck, shaking slightly. "What the hell is that thing? Carl, what is that?" Carl had no answer because his own mind was refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing, still frantically searching for a rational explanation that would make sense of the impossible. But there was no explanation. There was no logical reason for what clung to that debris 8 miles offshore in the middle of a Category 4 storm. The creature was real. It was there. It was looking directly at them with those glowing amber eyes, and every instinct in Carl's body, honed by years of facing danger, was screaming at him to turn the boat around and get away from this thing as fast as the engines would push them. But they were the Coast Guard. They had taken an oath to render aid to anyone in distress, regardless of the danger. Whatever this creature was, it was clearly in desperate trouble, clinging to wreckage in seas that would eventually tear it loose and drag it down into the crushing depths. Carl made the decision in a split second, a choice born of duty over instinct, knowing even as he gave the orders that he might be making a terrible, fatal mistake. He told Derek and Tommy to prepare for a rescue operation, to get the rescue net ready to approach the debris from the downwind side where they would have the most control. The motor lifeboat edged closer, its engines fighting to maintain position against the relentless push of the wind and current. Carl could see the creature more clearly now in the searchlight's unwavering glare. It was massive, easily 8 or 9 feet tall even in its hunched defensive position on the debris, with shoulders that must have been 4 feet across. The hair that covered its body was a dark brown that looked black when wet, thick and coarse, hanging in heavy, dripping ropes. Its hands were enormous, with fingers as thick as sausages wrapped around the wooden beam, and Carl could see the powerful muscles bunching and flexing beneath the soaked fur as the creature shifted its grip with each passing wave. The smell hit them when they got within 30 feet, a stench so overwhelming, so viscerally foul, that Tommy bent over the rail and vomited despite his dry suit and the hours of training designed to prepare Coast Guard crews for any situation. It was the smell of death and decay, of things rotting in dark, damp places, of meat gone bad and animal waste, and some deep, musky odor, all combined into a reek so powerful it seemed almost solid, a physical presence that invaded the nostrils and throat and lungs. Carl's eyes watered and his stomach heaved, but he kept his hands steady on the controls, bringing the boat closer still, watching the creature watch them with those amber eyes that held an intelligence that was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Derek and Tommy deployed the rescue net, a large mesh basket designed for retrieving people who were too injured or exhausted to climb aboard on their own. The plan was simple in theory. Get the net close enough for the creature to grab onto, then winch both the net and the creature out of the water and onto the deck where they could render aid and try to figure out what the hell they were dealing with. But the creature had other ideas. As the net splashed into the water beside the debris, as Derek called out encouragement in the standard, calming phrases used for water rescues, the creature's demeanor changed in an instant. The terror that had been visible in its posture transformed into something else entirely, something aggressive and explosively violent. It released its grip on the beam and lunged toward the boat with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large, its mouth opening to release another of those terrible, soul-shaking screams, its long arms reaching out with clear, hostile intent. The debris tilted dangerously as the creature's weight shifted, and for a terrifying moment, Carl thought it would fall into the water. Instead, it used the tilting platform to launch itself toward the motor lifeboat, covering the distance in a single, powerful leap that should have been physically impossible. The creature hit the side of the boat with tremendous force, its massive hands gripping the rail, its sheer weight causing the vessel to heel over at a dangerous angle. Martin was thrown across the wheelhouse, slamming into the bulkhead with a sharp cry of pain. Carl fought the controls, trying to compensate for the sudden, violent shift in balance. But the creature was climbing now, pulling itself up and over the rail with those impossibly strong arms. The smell intensified to the point where Carl's vision actually blurred from the tears streaming from his eyes. Tommy was closest to where the creature came over the side, and in a fatal moment of hesitation, born of youth and inexperience, he reached out to try to help rather than backing away to safety. The creature's hand shot out faster than Carl's eyes could follow. Those massive fingers closed around Tommy's arm just above the elbow, and even over the roar of the storm, Carl heard the sickening, explosive sound of bone breaking, a crack like a gunshot. Tommy screamed, a high, thin sound of pure, unadulterated agony, and the creature jerked him forward with casual, horrifying strength, lifting the young man completely off the deck as if he weighed nothing at all. Derek was shouting something, his mouth moving, but the words lost in the chaotic symphony of wind and screams. He dove toward the equipment locker, where they kept the distress flares and emergency gear. The creature hurled Tommy across the deck like a child discarding a broken toy. The young man's body hit the far rail with a sickening final thud before tumbling limply over the side into the black, churning water below. Carl abandoned the controls and lunged for the radio, his hands shaking so badly he could barely key the microphone. He was screaming into it, a raw, primal sound, calling Mayday, giving their position, trying to describe what was happening, even though the words sounded insane as they came out of his mouth. The motor lifeboat was wallowing now, beam on to the waves without anyone at the helm, and a large swell hit them broadside, sending a cascade of green water across the deck. The creature seemed unconcerned, maintaining its balance with an ease that spoke of an innate comfort in this violent environment. It turned toward Carl, its amber eyes full of a rage that was ancient and profound, and something that might have been hunger. It took a step forward, and the deck plates groaned under its immense weight. Carl could see details now that his mind would catalogue and carry forever. The way the water ran from the matted fur in rivulets, the network of old scars that crossed the creature's torso in pale, silvery lines, the yellowed, formidable teeth visible behind pulled-back lips, the fingers tipped with black nails that were almost claws. Derek emerged from the equipment locker with a flare gun in his hands. He did not hesitate. He pointed the weapon at the creature and fired point blank into its chest. The flare struck the creature square in the sternum and ignited with a brilliant, searing red light, the phosphorus burning at thousands of degrees. The creature's scream this time was pure, unadulterated pain, a sound so loud and terrible that Carl felt it vibrate in his bones. The creature staggered backward, clawing at the burning flare embedded in its chest, and Derek fired again. this shot catching the creature in the shoulder, adding a second point of searing light to the first. But instead of driving the creature off the boat, the pain seemed to enrage it further. It charged at Derek with terrifying speed, despite the burning flares. Derek tried to dodge, but there was nowhere to go on the pitching, water-slicked deck. The creature caught him with one sweeping arm, the impact lifting Derek completely off his feet and sending him crashing through the wheelhouse window. The safety glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, and Derek disappeared through the opening, his body landing somewhere inside the wheelhouse with a heavy, final thud. Carl was moving without conscious thought, pure adrenaline and years of training taking over. He grabbed the emergency axe from its mount on the bulkhead and raised it as the creature turned back toward him. The motor lifeboat rolled with another wave, and Carl's feet slipped on the wet deck, but he kept his grip on the axe, knowing it was the only weapon he had, knowing he was probably going to die in the next few seconds, but determined to go down fighting. Then the boat heaved violently, struck by a wave larger than the others, and the creature lost its footing for just a moment, its massive arms windmilling for balance. Carl saw his chance and swung the axe with all his strength, aiming for the creature's torso. But his own footing was unstable, and the blow went wide, the axe blade glancing off the creature's shoulder instead of biting deep. It was enough to draw blood, though, a dark line appearing where the blade had cut through fur and skin. The creature roared again, that terrible sound, and backhanded Carl across the face with casual, dismissive violence. The world went white, then black, then white again. Carl found himself on his back on the deck, his face a mask of pain, blood filling his mouth from where his teeth had cut the inside of his cheek. He could taste copper and salt, could feel the cold water soaking through his dry suit where the deck plates were awash, and he realized with a distant, detached surprise that he was still alive, still conscious. The creature was moving away from him, toward the stern, and for a moment Carl thought it was leaving, that maybe he had hurt it enough to drive it off. But then he saw what the creature was looking at, and a new, colder horror replaced the old one. There were more of them in the water. Carl could see them clearly in the searchlights that still blazed from the boat's superstructure, massive, dark shapes swimming through the waves with powerful, efficient strokes. Heads broke the surface to reveal faces like the one that had climbed aboard, amber eyes glowing in the light. There were at least 4 of them, maybe more, moving through the water as if they belonged there, as if the ocean was their natural home. They were converging on the motor lifeboat from multiple directions. The creature on the deck made a sound different from the screams, a series of deep, coughing barks that carried across the water. The swimming creatures answered with similar vocalizations. Carl realized with sick certainty that they were communicating, coordinating, working together with an intelligence that made them infinitely more dangerous than simple animals. The creature moved to the stern rail and dove off the boat without hesitation, vanishing into a swell with barely a splash. Carl was alone on the deck with the wind and the rain and the knowledge that something terrible was about to happen. He pulled himself to his feet, using the rail for support, his head spinning from the blow he had taken. He staggered toward the wheelhouse where Martin and Derek had both disappeared. The wheelhouse was a wreck, glass everywhere, equipment torn loose from its mounts. Martin was crawling slowly toward the radio, one arm hanging uselessly at his side, clearly broken. Derek lay motionless near the navigator's station, his head bent at an angle that Carl knew was wrong. New meant death. Carl felt something inside him crack at the sight of his friend's body. But there was no time for grief. The boat was rocking violently now, not from the waves, but from something else. From powerful impacts against the hull, regular and rhythmic and horrifyingly deliberate, the creatures were hitting the boat from below. Powerful strikes that shook the entire vessel. Carl could hear the sound of metal groaning under the stress. He reached Martin and helped him to his feet, and together they stumbled to the radio. Martin was trying to speak, but blood kept coming from his mouth, making his words wet and unclear. The radio was still working, a miracle in the chaos. Carl grabbed the microphone and gave their position again, shouted that they were under attack, that they needed immediate assistance, that Tommy was in the water, that Derek was dead, that there were creatures, multiple creatures. He knew he sounded crazy, but he did not care because it was all true, every impossible, insane word of it. The voice that answered was Lieutenant Commander Brennan's. She was asking questions, trying to understand, telling him that help was coming, but her words sounded distant and unimportant compared to the immediate, overwhelming reality of the situation. Another impact, harder than the others, and this time Carl heard the unmistakable, terrifying sound of the hull breaching, metal tearing, water rushing in. The motor lifeboat listed suddenly to port, the deck tilting at an angle that could only mean catastrophic damage. Carl knew with absolute certainty that the boat was sinking, that the creatures had torn a hole through the reinforced hull, that they had maybe 2 minutes before the ocean claimed the vessel entirely. He pulled Martin toward the door, toward the deck, toward the life raft that was mounted in a quick-release container amidships. They made it maybe 3 steps before the boat rolled completely, the port rail going under, green water flooding across the deck and through the shattered wheelhouse windows. Carl lost his grip on Martin, lost his footing, felt the world turn sideways as the motor lifeboat capsized. Then he was in the water, the cold hitting him like a physical blow despite the dry suit, the waves closing over his head and pulling him down into the suffocating darkness.